Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the 6th in the 2017 Richard M. Fairbanks School of Public Health Center for Public Health Practice Insights and Innovation Series, Creating Opportunities to Achieve Optimal Health. Today, we're going to explore additional ways which we can address public health challenges through a health equity lens. We're so fortunate to be joined by Dr. Carrie Foote. Dr. Carrie, as her students affectionately call her, is a sociology professor at Indiana University here in Indianapolis. She tested positive for HIV in 1988. Once homeless and a person injecting drugs on the street, she is now a scholar, teacher, mother, and activist, and is deeply committed to the movement to end HIV criminalization. Dr. Foote is a member of Yale University's HIV Criminalization Research Group and the grassroots-based Zero HIV Criminalization Reform Project. Most recently, she formed the HIV Modernization Movement Indiana, which is working tirelessly to modernize Indiana's criminal HIV laws. Today, Dr. Carey is going to talk to us about laws that criminalize people with HIV, how they stigmatize people with HIV, why they are outdated, and recent efforts to reform them. After today's webinar, you will be sent a link to a short survey evaluation of this presentation. Please help us meet your needs in future webinar presentations by completing this evaluation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carrie Foote. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's nice to be here today to share some information about myself and about HIV criminalization. As Dr. Dubey just mentioned, I tested positive for HIV in 1988, and I kind of see myself as a real good example of what can happen when you provide people living with HIV care, treatment, treat them with compassion. You don't stigmatize them, as well as people who inject drugs. I am a former injection drug user. And because I was provided support, care, and treatment, I am here today almost living with HIV for 30 years. So we've had incredible advances in the world of HIV. Lots of promising things happen. But at the same time, we find that despite doing so well living with HIV, I see myself as I live with an illness like any other illness, but according to our criminal justice system, I am a potential criminal. I am a potential dangerous weapon. I am something to be afraid of because there are laws out there that criminalize HIV. So I'm going to talk to you and kind of explain exactly what that means, what's so bad about these laws that criminalize people living with HIV, and how they are incredibly harmful, not just for those of us living with HIV, but for everybody who's working in the public health arena, in the medical arena that's trying to provide good supportive services to people with HIV and trying to end the epidemic. So first, just kind of moving on, let's see how this works. Forward. Which one?
That one. Oh,
Wait. I'm trying to change a slide here.
there we go.
No, I think I turned it off. Sorry. So I'm going to ask you a few questions to think about, whether you agree, disagree, or you're unsure. So people living with HIV who lie to their sexual partners about their HIV status but don't intend any harm should be charged with a crime. So think about that, whether you agree, disagree, or unsure. Which one do I do?
Yeah.
That one. Okay. People who intentionally try to transmit HIV to others should be prosecuted under HIV-specific laws. Third one, it should be a crime for people who know they are HIV positive to attempt to donate blood products. So that would be whether it's blood itself or blood serum that's often used to make pharmaceuticals. An HIV positive person who physically assaults someone with bodily fluids or waste, such as spit, blood, or feces, should face harsher sentences than the initial crime because of their HIV status, also known as sentence enhancement. Disclosing one's HIV status to a sexual partner should not be mandated by law. HIV-specific laws serve public health goals. That is, they help prevent the spread of HIV in some cases. So I just want you to think about those statements, whether you agree, disagree, or unsure. And at the end of this webinar, we'll come back to them and I'll provide our answers as advocates on the ground to these questions in terms of reforming HIV criminal laws. So what is HIV criminalization? It's the unjust use of one's HIV positive status in a criminal prosecution. This can either occur under HIV-specific laws that apply specifically to people living with HIV, or it can actually occur under our general criminal laws where charges or punishments are initiated or heightened solely because of a person's HIV status. So criminalization can occur in two ways: HIV-specific laws that are out there, as well as under our general laws. So you don't necessarily need a specific law to criminalize somebody because of their HIV status. So before we kind of get into what's wrong with these laws, it's important that we're all on the same page in terms of understanding the basics of just HIV science, treatment, prevention, transmission, and how that all works. And one of the reasons that's important to know where we are today is because the epidemic is very different now than it was 30 years ago back in the 80s. We've made leaps and bounds in the HIV epidemic in all these areas, prevention and treatment. And when we know the current science, it allows us to look at the laws, specifically the HIV-specific ones, to ask whether they are consistent with basic current knowledge around HIV today. Because most of these laws were enacted in the late 80s and the early 90s, and there have been tremendous changes in the science of HIV since then. So with treatment, we now know that people living with HIV can have a near normal life expectancy. There was an article that just came out, I believe it was in the Lancet, that showed that with treatment, with care, someone newly diagnosed today is expected to live to their mid-70s. So HIV is clearly a chronic manageable disease. With transmission, this information really has not changed since the beginning of the epidemic. HIV is spread through penetrative sex, syringe sharing, mother-to-child transmission, and blood transfusion prior to FDA screening in the United States. We've known for years, again, since the beginning of the epidemic, that saliva, urine, and tears do not spread HIV. We also know that blood outside the body is not dangerous for contracting HIV. HIV cannot live outside the human body. In fact, the virus will die very quickly within seconds when exposed to air. So those are just basic facts. We also know that, to begin with, HIV is not easily transmitted, and a lot of people don't really know this. So this is a great CDC chart that shows, without doing any kind of preventive efforts, without using condoms or other prevention techniques that we have today, HIV is not an easy virus to transmit to somebody else. Sexually, you're much more likely to contract gonorrhea, syphilis, herpes, other sexually transmitted diseases. So if you look at, for example, sexually, the most risky sexual act would be receptive anal intercourse, and even there, it's about less than 1% of the time somebody would actually contract HIV if exposed per 10,000 exposures. So this basically chart just shows, just to educate people, HIV is not easily transmitted. And then what we know today, we have some very highly effective forms of HIV prevention. So we've had condoms that have been around forever. We have PrEP. We have, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV. We have ART, which is antiretroviral treatment in the person who's HIV positive. And then we have the latest science of being undetectable with your viral load, and you cannot transmit HIV sexually. So here's just some advertisements showcasing some of these latest developments in HIV science, HIV prevention. So we know that if somebody does not have HIV and they take PrEP, 1 pill a day, that it's highly effective for preventing HIV up to 99%. Very effective form of HIV prevention. We also know that if you take treatment, just being on treatment alone dramatically reduces the chances of someone with HIV passing on HIV to their partners. And then the latest science, we do know now that if a person is on treatment and they have a sustained undetectable viral load, that means HIV becomes untransmittable. You cannot transmit HIV to your sexual partner. And that is just groundbreaking, because it means somebody who's in treatment, on care, undetectable, basically poses no potential even chance. They don't even expose their partners to HIV. We also know that now, because of treatment, we can prevent the spread of HIV from mother to child. So dramatic advances in the world of HIV science. And we're like, this is great. People are living longer. People are doing well. This is a chronic manageable illness. We can prevent the spread of HIV. But yet, at the same time, we're criminalizing people living with HIV solely because they have HIV. So that's important to really understand, that it's the person's HIV status, and because of that, we're creating this, or have created, a viral underclass in our criminal justice system, where people living with HIV are treated differently solely because of their HIV status. And they are actually criminalized because of their HIV status, not because of something else that they did. It's because they live with HIV, and I'll explain that in a minute. So these are just two examples of some of the horrific things that have happened over the last 20 years to two men who are living with HIV. So Nick Rhodes is from Iowa. Kerry Thomas he lives in Idaho. Both of these men were arrested for engaging in consensual adult sexual practices, where both of them at the time had undetectable viral loads. Both of them used a condom. And what they didn't do is they did not disclose their HIV status to their sexual partners prior to engaging in their sexual behaviors. And in both of those states at the time, there were laws on the books that criminalized people with HIV for non-disclosure of their HIV status. Both were arrested, both were tried, and both were convicted. In both cases, Nick Rhodes got 25 years in prison for non-disclosure. And in Kerry Thomas's case, he got 30 years for non-disclosure. And what you have to really understand here is the crime they were convicted of was a simple, did you tell or not tell your sexual partner? In both cases, there was no even chance that their partners could have contracted HIV. In both cases, there was no HIV transmitted, and in both cases, we're talking about consensual sexual acts between adults engaging in behaviors that both consented to. And in Nick Rhodes' case, in addition to 25 years in prison, he also was put on a lifetime sex offender list. Now, fortunately, in Iowa, they have since reformed their laws, and Nick's sentence has been reversed. But currently, right now, Kerry Thomas still sits in an Idaho prison. So this raises the issue of what's happening out there with our laws. And when you look at this map of the United States here, this kind of shows, just in color coding, the states that are in red, which we're here in Indiana, are states that have HIV-specific statutes on the books and have had at least one prosecution in the past 2 years. The states that have an exclamation point are states where if you get arrested under the HIV-specific laws or general laws, that you can be put on the sex offender list for an HIV-alleged specific crime. Now, the yellow states are states where there are laws but no recent reported prosecutions. The orange states are states where there are HIV-related prosecutions, but there are no laws, no HIV-specific laws. So, for example, in Texas, there have been prosecutions, but there are no HIV-specific laws. People in Texas have been prosecuted for their HIV status under general laws. And then the gray states have no HIV-specific laws and no prosecutions. So this is just a snapshot of what's going on out there in the United States. And it's a little bit hard to read some of the examples they have there, but the examples range from having sex while HIV positive and not disclosing your HIV status, to spitting on somebody while HIV positive. So it's highly variable. And just to share some of these cases of people who've been arrested on under these laws in different states. So Apollo lives in Oklahoma, And Apollo got into, this was a couple of years ago, he got into a verbal altercation with a woman in public where they were screaming verbally at each other. In the process of screaming at each other, somebody had called the cops. As the cops were coming, Apollo sneezed and phlegm and saliva just went out, just went out into the air. When the cops arrived, the women started screaming to the cops, "He has HIV, he has HIV, he tried to give me HIV by sneezing on me." The cops took a bag, put it over Apollo's head, and arrested him for attempted harm to another human being because he was HIV positive by sneezing. And over the course of time, his charges were eventually completely dropped. But this was, to emphasize, this was just 2 years ago. We're not talking about the 1980s that this happened. This was 2 years ago, where clearly we know phlegm does not transmit HIV and that sort of thing. Juanita Jones is a sex worker in Florida, and she had proposed an offer to an undercover police officer to have sex. He arrested her for solicitation, trying to have sex under the solicitation laws for prostitution, and then discovered she was HIV positive along the way and added sentence enhancement charges to her because she was HIV positive. Taomi Luckett is a transgendered woman who lives in Arkansas. On her way home from work one night, she was escorted by a male counterpart who drove her home, dropped her off at the house, forced his way into her house, sexually assaulted her. In Arkansas, they have HIV-specific laws on the books that criminalize non-disclosure. Taomi was afraid to report her sexual assault to the police for fear that her assaulter would file countercharges that she did not disclose her HIV status to her sexual assailant. And the same thing, just to emphasize, as a woman living with HIV, if I am sexually assaulted in the state of Indiana, I am legally required to disclose my HIV status to my rapist. If I do not do that, I can be prosecuted under our HIV-specific laws because the crime is non-disclosure. That's what these laws around sex are often based on. So Julie Graham lives in Pennsylvania. There are no HIV-specific laws in Pennsylvania. Julie Graham started dating a coworker, and no real sexual activity had happened. But one night, she invited him over to her house. They had a lot to drink. They ended up having sex, and she doesn't really even remember much of the night. But soon after, the coworker learned that Julie was HIV positive and had not told him her HIV status, and he pressed charges against her under their general assault laws. And fortunately, she was able to get really, really good help so that she did not do time and ended up getting probation. But again, here we have a situation where she engaged in, who knows if it was even consensual sex, if it could even have been date rape. She doesn't even remember much of having sex with the coworker and that sort of thing. Michael Johnson, originally from Indiana, a young gay black male who went off to college in Missouri and engaged in consensual sexual behaviors with several men who then some of them filed charges against him for non-disclosure. He was 21 years old at the time of the charges, a very promising college career ahead of him, and he ended up getting 30 years in Missouri under Missouri's non-disclosure laws, and currently is sitting in a prison there under their laws. Eddie Casto, down at the bottom, is from Washington. Now, Eddie was born with HIV. So, he contracted it from mother to child transmission. And just to point out here, for our youth and our children and people who are born with HIV, if you are born in, the US tells us everyone is born into this country equal. But if you're born HIV positive and you're born in a state that has HIV specific laws, you are not equal in that state. You are treated differently from birth because there are laws on the books that treat you differently and require different expectations of you just because you're HIV positive. So Eddie was arrested at the age of 18 for having consensual sexual activities with his girlfriend at the time, but he did not disclose his HIV status and ended up getting arrested, and he did some time in Washington under those laws. Robert Suttle was in a contentious relationship. He's from Louisiana, where he did not disclose his HIV status to his partner. When they broke up, his partner found out about it. No one contracted HIV in the relationship or anything, but the partner filed charges because he was angry at his ex-boyfriend. Robert got arrested, ended up being put on the sex offender list. And this is very serious. When you're put on a sex offender list, all of these crimes that people with HIV are charged under, they're not misdemeanors. They're all felony convictions, which dramatically have negative impacts on people's lives. And Robert Suttle, right now, he is not in prison. He ended up serving about 8 months in prison and then is out on probation. But until this day, and that happened, I believe it was 2008, he still has a driver's license that lists him, you can see at the bottom of his picture, as a sex offender wherever he goes, and he shows that license. Willie Campbell, this is perhaps, I think, one of the most tragic cases that I've seen happen with HIV criminalization. Willie Campbell was a homeless African-American male in Texas. He was on the street. He was drunk. He passed out. Police officers were called to this man passed out on the street. They came, they woke him up, and he was still intoxicated, and he became very aggressive towards the police officers, angry, started yelling and spitting at them, and he was arrested for attempted murder by spit on these police officers, and he got 25 years under Texas attempted murder laws in the state of Texas, and right now still is serving time, 25 years for spitting on a police officer while HIV positive. And what's so tragic to me about his case is he is probably among one of the most vulnerable groups of people living with HIV. He was homeless, he was Black, dealing with substance abuse problems, likely, we suspect, unmet mental health needs, and now we've criminalized him for spitting on a police officer when we know that spit doesn't even transmit HIV. So that raises another harm of these laws that you can see at the bottom of this slide, is that we do find in the research that we're starting to collect on who gets prosecuted, what are their backgrounds, what are their identities, is that there is a disproportionate impact on African Americans, other racial ethnic minorities, trans women, people with unstable housing, sex workers, and those with unmet mental health needs. So people who are already very vulnerable and very prone to being criminalized now are the most likely to face prosecution under our HIV criminal laws. That said, anybody living with HIV could potentially be arrested under our laws. So Indiana, what does Indiana look like? We have several laws that criminalize people with HIV in many different ways. So the most common one that most people are familiar with is what's called our duty to warn laws. And I'll just stop there. Think about the words duty to warn. So I'm a person living with HIV, and it is my duty to warn my sexual partner or my injecting drug-using partner. I must warn them of my HIV status before engaging in sexual acts or sharing syringes. The whole idea of duty to warn right there sends this message that I am a very, very dangerous person. I am warning you that, maybe you shouldn't do this with me because I am very dangerous. Now, this particular law requires disclosure. We call it the disclosure law. And it criminalizes not just people living with HIV, but also people living with hepatitis B. What's interesting is when you have laws that seem to criminalize multiple viruses, people living with different viruses, which is rare. Most of these laws, usually it's very HIV specific. We find that when you look at prosecutions, it's always people living with HIV, and people who have these other illnesses are never criminalized. And that is rooted in HIV stigma and misunderstandings of HIV and this heightened just idea and stereotype that we are actually dangerous and we do need to be controlled and we do need to be regulated. And one thing, as we'll point out, with these laws, you will notice that the crime is non-disclosure. In most crimes, usually intent matters, but in these cases, intent doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether I intend to harm somebody at all. It also doesn't matter whether harm occurred. What matters is a verbal behavior of disclosure or not, and that's the crime. Other laws in the state of Indiana, we have laws that criminalize the donation, sale, or transfer of semen, blood, or serum when HIV positive. We also have laws for battery and malicious mischief by bodily fluid. For these, it criminalizes people living with HIV, people with tuberculosis, and all of the hepatitis. A, B, C, D, the whole entire alphabet is included there. What's different with HIV is there's further sentence enhancement for these crimes if you're HIV positive, has a harsher sentence than if you're living with TB or hepatitis. So what's so bad about these laws that criminalize people living with HIV? There's a lot of reasons that have been put forth on why these laws are harmful and why we need to modernize them. And I won't go into all of them just because there are so many. But most of you are working in the area of public health. And this is really important because public health wants to end the HIV epidemic. Public health wants to improve the lives and the quality of lives of those people living with HIV. So the question is, from a public health perspective, do these laws actually encourage safer sex behaviors? Do they actually prevent the spread of HIV? And what we find in not one study that has been done, have we found any studies that show that these laws actually prevent the spread of HIV. They do not prevent the spread of HIV. They are not based on good public health HIV prevention science. It does not deter risk behaviors. So from a public health perspective, they're not doing what people might have thought when they created these laws, what they were intended to do. And one thing that's important is when these laws were put in place, it really had nothing to do with based on good science of HIV prevention or anything there. It was basically laws were put in place out of people's fears. They were also put in place early on in the epidemic because Ryan White funding required that states have some way to punish people who intentionally tried to spread HIV. And some states went and created laws, but they created bad criminal laws that were not based on intent to harm and were based on things like disclosure or based on things like spitting on somebody that doesn't transmit HIV. So the laws to begin with were not based on science. We do find that there is some disincentive to HIV testing. There's mixed studies on that. A lot of studies show, well, we're not really finding that it deters HIV testing, where there's a lot of anecdotal evidence in the community and in some qualitative studies to show that, well, in certain populations, like among sex workers who may be HIV positive, they may be afraid to get an HIV test because it further criminalizes them and that sort of thing. So more research needs to be done there. It may actually encourage non-disclosure. And this is an interesting finding because often when people test HIV positive, they are afraid to disclose. They're scared. They don't want to be rejected. So they may be with a sexual partner. They may not disclose their status. And then they find, well, now I might feel more comfortable to share my status with my partner. But if they know there's a law in their state, they may be hesitant to disclose because what if the partner gets angry and then files charges? Well, you didn't disclose to me the first time. So it could have this unintended consequence of encouraging non-disclosure. It can alienate patients from providers, and here providers often become tools of criminalization, and this is pretty big in the state of Indiana because in Indiana we have public health policies that require providers to counsel their patients and their clients around our laws in our state. So if you go in to see your medical provider or you go in to see your case manager and they start talking to you about laws where you could be criminalized and you could be thrown in jail, they may be suspicious of their provider. Well, can I be open with you if I'm not disclosing? Are you going to turn me over to the law? They may not be forthcoming about challenges they may have with non-disclosure, etc. It can send inaccurate messages regarding prevention responsibility and public health. one of the predominant valued messages around one's own sexual health is individuals are responsible for their own sexual health. It's not anyone's burden over the other. People are equally responsible. And it's not that the person with HIV is more responsible for protecting the health of their partners. Everyone is responsible themselves. But what these laws do is they send the message that the HIV positive person has more responsibility, and also can send this message to the partner that says, well, we have laws in our state, so they're legally required to disclose. So if somebody doesn't disclose, they might feel like, well, I don't need to worry about HIV. And that's sending an inaccurate message around what they need to be concerned about in terms of their own sexual health. Inaccurate messaging around HIV transmission. A lot of these laws imply risks that don't exist or pose little risk of HIV transmission. And then non-disclosure is broadly and falsely misunderstood as intent to harm. Non-disclosure usually most of the time has to do with HIV stigma, with fear of rejection, fear of actual real harm that can come to an individual, and has absolutely nothing to do with intent to harm another person, but the laws imply that they do. So another major criticism of these laws is it raises due process issues. So this is kind of the criminal justice argument for why we need to change these laws. You have a public health argument. They're not based on current science. They contradict best practices in public health. And then you have the criminal justice argument. Are these laws fairly applied? And we find in the criminal justice argument that there's a lot of bad things about these laws, that even in the criminal justice system, they say whoever created these laws knew very little about what makes a good criminal justice law. Intent requirement has disappeared, has nothing to do with intent to harm. It's extremely difficult to prove that a person disclosed. There's an incredible amount of juror moral disapproval and disconnect that occurs if somebody's case goes before a juror trial. So like Michael Johnson, the young black gay male who I had on the previous slide, he was tried in a rural part of Missouri by an all-white jury where when they talked about same-sex behaviors among men, the jurors put their face down, they made faces, and had all this moral disapproval because of who Michael was and the kinds of sexual behaviors he's engaged in. And that kind of thing happens because we are dealing often with HIV, already marginalized groups who are most likely to be prosecuted under these laws. In the laws, scientific details are often ignored. It doesn't matter what the best current science is. Results in disproportionate punishment, sometimes more than rape or manslaughter. So getting 25 or 30 years in prison for non-disclosure. Nobody gets HIV, no exposure of HIV, incredibly disproportionate punishment. It also singles out HIV to be treated differently. What about human papillomavirus? When you think about that, how many people in the population have HPV and how many women die from cervical cancer every year? That's a very serious condition, yet there are no laws that criminalize non-disclosure of people living with HPV. Now, hepatitis C, there are some laws that criminalize hepatitis C, but not in terms of non-disclosure. And hepatitis C, as we know, is also very prevalent throughout the population, as well as a very, very serious condition that if left untreated can be life-threatening. And then finally, the other major group of arguments that are out there on why we need to change these laws and what's wrong with them is that they inflict serious group and individual harms. So the question here is, do these laws hurt people living with HIV? Number one, there's no doubt that they contribute to stigma. Anytime you have a law that criminalizes somebody based upon something they cannot change about themselves, it's going to contribute to HIV stigma. And we know that HIV stigma remains one of the #1 barriers to providing good care and to ending this epidemic. It may result in secondary disclosure that can cause harm. So this is interesting. So we have a law in about 30 states that criminalize people living with HIV who do not disclose their HIV status. But yet I have a law that compels me to disclose my HIV status to my sexual partner. But at the same time, there's nothing to protect me now on what that partner does with that information. They can use that information to cause great harm precisely because of HIV stigma. People with HIV are still discriminated against in jobs, in housing, in relationships, in all kinds of different ways. So it could result in secondary disclosure because there's nothing in these laws that protect the disclosure process and harm that could occur there. It can be used as a coercive tool by the HIV negative partner. And this often happens particularly in relationships where there's intimate partner violence already, particularly with women, where a man can threaten his female partner, well, if you leave me, I'm going to go tell the police that you didn't disclose your HIV status with me, and it coerces the positive partner to stay in a relationship that may be harmful and abusive. It can ruin individual lives. You can become a sex offender in some states. All of these laws are felony convictions, and felonies just have so many issues with getting housing, getting work, all kinds of negative consequences. Negatively affect marginalized and vulnerable populations. They stigmatize all people with HIV, so it's not just the person who gets arrested. By having these laws, even if, for example, I as a person living with HIV never get arrested, never risk arrest, it's contributing to my stigma because there's a law out there. And often this happens through sensationalized media reports. Often when somebody is arrested by these laws, the media goes and makes a huge sensational headline, you know, HIV predator trying to infect people with HIV. They have exposed hundreds of people to HIV. And then often includes misinformation in the media reports because the journalists know very little bit about HIV. And then the general public sees that and they think, wow, people with HIV must be still very dangerous. This is a scary thing. So it contributes to stigmatizing all people with HIV. Rape may not be reported. Physical violence may not be reported because people fear counter charges based on their HIV status. So all sorts of individual and group harms can occur. So what's so bad about these laws, to kind of just summarize? Basically, they do more harm than good. Most of these laws were enacted in the late 80s and the early 90s when we really didn't know, we didn't have good effective treatments. It was a very different world back then with HIV. But we find today that they're outdated and they do incredible harm. These laws are not just restricted to the United States, they are global. People are being prosecuted around the world, and there is a global movement to reform and modernize these laws. So to sum it up, they're contrary to public health practices, have not been proven anywhere in the world to be an effective HIV prevention approach. They ignore due process issues, lead to unjust prosecutions, and they inflict incredible group and individual harms. So here's where we're calling for change. We need to change these laws. They're outdated. They need to be modernized. In some cases, we might want to repeal them. Other cases, we might want to modernize them. And there is no real model on what you do because we haven't had something like this really ever where a disease has been criminalized to the extent that HIV has in our criminal justice system. So this slide just gives you a sample of all the groups that are calling for change. And you can see it includes a lot of groups here in the United States, you know, from the American Nurses Associations of Nurses in AIDS Care, the American Medical Association, the U.S. Department of Justice, the White House National AIDS Strategy, American Psychological Association. I mean, it goes on. And then you have global groups, UN AIDS, HIV Justice Worldwide, the Oslo Declaration of HIV Criminalization. So several groups and bodies have looked at these laws and said, yes, we need change. Change needs to occur. We do have in the United States a federal legislation that has been slowly getting co-sponsors and will eventually probably get passed at the federal level. It basically is a no-cost legislation, doesn't require any more dollars, so really states have nothing to lose by supporting it. But it's the Repeal HIV Discrimination Act, and what this act would do, it would repeal existing policies that encourage and allow for legal HIV discrimination. It's spearheaded by Barbara Lee out of California. I'm not sure how many co-sponsors it has right now, but it does have quite a few, and it's slowly just moving through the House of Representatives, and it'll take time, but hopefully it'll pass eventually. What this federal law would require, it would mandate that all states start to review the laws that are on their books and review policies to ensure that they're not allowing for legal HIV discrimination. So that's something that's happening on the federal level. We also have had states, Indiana is one of them now, that are working on state legislative solutions. And in this case, states are doing different things. Right now, we have 2 states that have been successful. We have Iowa that has reformed their HIV disclosure laws. They still have an HIV-specific law, but it's a better law that's based on actual intent to harm. Because anyone would agree that, well, if I have HIV and I actually want to harm you with my HIV and I make an active effort to intentionally pass on HIV to you, I don't think anybody would argue that that should be a crime, like any other crime, if I intend to harm you with a knife and I actually follow through with that. What we find, though, is those cases of actual intent to harm have been incredibly, incredibly rare in these cases. One case that comes to mind that did get a lot of attention was a father who injected his infant son with blood that had HIV in an effort to not pay child support, and basically told the mother of the child, well, that baby won't be around much longer because I just gave that baby HIV and I won't have to pay child support. And he was prosecuted under our criminal laws for intending to harm and attempted murder of his baby, and is currently, I think he got life in prison for that. And that would be a case of intent to harm with HIV. But what we find, people being prosecuted under these laws, there is no intent to harm. Often there's no exposure. In most cases, HIV transmission doesn't even occur. And then in the end, we're talking about, in most cases, consensual adult sexual activities that people are engaging in. So in these different states, some are aiming to eliminate the laws altogether. Some are aiming to reform the laws to cover only intent to harm. Those are the Department of Justice guidance and recommendation. Some are broadening the laws to include other transmittable infections with similarly potential harms and reform those laws and reflect actual potential harms, but also have, if there is harms, that the consequences shouldn't be way out of proportion and that sort of thing. So there are different legislative solutions that are going on. Here in Indiana, we're looking right now at repealing some of our laws and modernizing others. We have about 6 laws on our books that criminalize people with HIV. So this is our group in Indiana that I spearheaded last summer. It's the HIV Modernization movement, and we're just a diverse group of individuals seeking to modernize Indiana's criminal HIV laws. We're people living with HIV, we're healthcare providers, we're family and friends of people living with HIV, people in public health, people in the social sciences, just a real diverse group of people here in Indiana. This is our website. We do have a website. If you're interested in getting involved, you can go to the Get Involved page. There's a click here if you want to sign up as an individual on our listserv and just follow our work and just see what's going on in Indiana. We are trying to make an effort to reach every part of the state to do presentations. So if you're in a particular group or clinic and you want us to come to your clinic and talk about specifically what's going on in Indiana, some of the harms in Indiana, one thing in Indiana is we also have public health policies that are linked to our laws that currently our state health department is trying to modernize as well, and we can talk about those and what's happening there to try to improve the laws in the state of Indiana. So let's go back to our statements. Do you agree, disagree, or are you unsure? So here's our answer. The first one, people living with HIV who lie to their sexual partners about their HIV status but don't intend any harm should be charged with a crime. Our answer is no. If they're engaging in consensual sexual practices, that's between sex partners. People lie about all kinds of things to their sexual partners and are not criminalized for those things, including things that can potentially have life-changing consequences for them, such as lying about being on birth control, and then suddenly somebody's pregnant And it's like, oh my gosh, now I have to take care of this child. I had no intention of having a child. And that can have a life-changing consequence. But we don't criminalize contraceptive fraud when people lie about things like that. And when it's consensual sexual sex between partners, that is something that normally the law doesn't get involved in, of what happens there. People who intentionally try to transmit HIV to others should be prosecuted under HIV-specific laws. So here we have no, but maybe the best option. And here we're looking at intentionally trying to transmit. So there's an intent to actually transmit a virus that can be life-changing for that person. If left untreated, could be life-threatening. We do know if treated, it's a chronic manageable illness. Should be prosecuted under HIV-specific laws. There's some arguments that they should be prosecuted under our general intent to harm laws, as if don't single out HIV as to be treated differently. The other argument against that is that people are misusing the general laws when it comes to HIV. So a better practice might be to have a good HIV-specific law, so that if somebody is charged as allegedly intending to harm someone else, you go to a good law, the HIV-specific one, that was designed in a way that would actually prosecute that based upon the current science and that sort of thing. So there's mix in terms of whether it should be an HIV-specific law or prosecuted under our general intent to harm laws. It should be a crime for people who know they are HIV positive to attempt to donate blood products. So the answer here is a clear no. And in some ways, this law in our state of the Indiana is one that really bothers me the most. We've been starting to do research on how many people have been arrested and prosecuted under our laws in the state of Indiana. And we have found dozens of people prosecuted for attempting to donate serum for money while HIV positive. And usually you get maybe $30 or $40 every time you donate serum. In Indiana, it's a felony conviction. Most people arrested under attempting to donate serum while knowingly HIV positive, you have to know you're HIV positive to be prosecuted, are serving a year in prison. And to me, what's horrific about that law is there's absolutely zero threat or risk to the blood supply because the FDA protects our blood products. No other person with any other infectious disease that is on the do not donate list, and there's a whole host of them, from all the hepatitis C's to a whole bunch of others where you can't donate products, they would just simply be turned away and say, I'm sorry, you can't donate. They would be put on the we have a national do not donate donor list, a database that all these blood and serum donation groups have access to make sure that, are you on the list? Do we kick you off? But in the case of people with HIV, they're criminalized, and it's really for absolutely no reason whatsoever, because there's no threat to the blood supply at all. They should just be turned away, provided care, resources, that sort of thing. An HIV positive person who physically assaults someone with bodily fluids or waste should face harsher sentences than the initial crime because of their status. So this is sentence enhancement. And here it's a clear no. In all of these cases, none of these, it doesn't matter what it is, even if it's blood outside the body is not a risk to another person when it comes to HIV. They should just be prosecuted under the general battery laws that exist by bodily fluid like anybody else. There should not be sentence enhancement. Disclosing one's status to a sexual partner should not be mandated by law. This is a clear no. Disclosing one's status is basically, this is where you're really criminalize somebody solely because of their HIV status. It's not based on intent to harm. It's not based on whether harm occurs. It doesn't matter whether there was even harm. If I'm undetectable, for example, right now, I cannot pass on HIV to my sexual partner. But yet, if I don't disclose, even though there's no chance that I can pass it on, I can be prosecuted under Indiana's laws. So they don't take into account current science. And then HIV-specific laws serve public health goals. They help prevent HIV in some cases. This is a clear no, and there's been a lot of research studies that have been done to actually look at this question. Do they actually do anything good in the realm of public health? And not one study has reported any good. On the contrary, studies are showing either they do nothing or they report great harms to individuals and groups, and reform is needed. And for all of these, if anybody wants, I have some sites on our website. If you go there, there's a resource page that has some of the major summaries of studies. But if you want anything specific linked to some of our specific laws, I can get you those references. Okay, so I think we'll probably stop because it's only 10 minutes and skip the film.
Okay, it's up to you. We don't have any questions at this time. So
well, maybe then I will. It's only 7 minutes. Let's show the film.
Let's show the
So I have a short film here that was done by the Zero Project, and the Zero Project is a national criminalization reform group. They advise us here in Indiana. They've been working on this for quite a while, and this is a little short film that they've put together to kind of showcase some of the harms of criminalization, and it's only about 7.5 minutes, and then we'll end.
Great. While we're getting the film ready, I'll just say thank you to Dr. Carrie Foote for sharing her incredible work with us. I understand that for some of you, this may be information that you're hearing for the first time. Please know if you have any questions for Dr. Carrie, I'm happy to get them to her. You can email me at jduve, D-U-W-V-E, @iu.edu, and I'll put that in the chat box. And I will pass those to Dr. Carrie. Thank you very much for joining us today.
So here goes the film.
I was trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. A law, something is against the law, then it's telling society that that is unacceptable, that's bad behavior, and I think the severity of that punishment tells you how bad you are as a person. You're a Class B felon, lifetime sex offender. You are a very, very, very bad person. You did a very, very, very bad thing. And so that's just, programmed into you, and, you go through the correctional system and everyone's telling you the same thing, and you're just like, I'm a very bad person, very bad person.
Today in court, Rouse was charged with another count of first-degree assault. The special statute covers passing on AIDS or poisoning someone with a destructive substance.
The prosecutor asked that another charge, unlawful use of a harmful device, in this case Alan's HIV status, be added. That's a 15-year felony. The judge agreed.
They learned that Chambers is HIV positive. Fort Mill police upped the charge from simple assault to assault and battery with intent to kill.
More serious charges were added because the defendant is HIV positive.
Because the suspect has HIV, he's facing some unusually serious charges.
Authorities, though, still consider him a danger as long as he can infect others.
HIV, gay, sex, all wrapped into one. It's just like it's a gift on a platter. Whatever the facts are, whatever the science is, it does not matter.
Come home one day and you just kind of get a feel, someone's been in your apartment or your home. And I looked on the counter and I saw a document, which was a search warrant, left by the sex crime detective. They showed up to arrest me, and they arrested me at work.
So me getting HIV, it was like a shock. It was just like, how did I get this? How did it hit the Howells house? How did it hit here? I'm a church girl. My dad's a pastor. He's still a pastor. So we grew up in church. Hallelujah, thanking Jesus all day long. Being a good wife, and I did the right thing, and because of an affair that happened in my marriage by my spouse at the time, that's how I got it. He looked at me just like a man who was, he looked at me just as if I was negative, just like I'm normal. How do I even disclose my status? How do I do this? How do I get those words out my mouth? HIV. I was afraid of how he was going to look at me. I was afraid that how he would judge me, and the only thing I could say is you need to get a condom. I had so many thoughts going on my head when I was sitting in court. Like, what if I walk out and so many people walking around calling me the monster? What if I get labeled a sex offender? What if they take my kids away from me? If convicted, I was looking at 8 to 12 years. And
if convicted, then the sentence would be anywhere from 0 to 10 years.
The full 25 years.
The Attorney General is arguing Williams should be held indefinitely under a newly enacted civil confinement law.
New York State wants to find another way to keep him behind bars permanently.
I felt like I went out and killed a whole bunch of people. They made me feel like that.
I mean, one thing I always told myself, and I've shared with others, that I would never end up at a police station. I would never go to jail because I felt like I was always a law-abiding citizen. My mother had me at a very young age. 12 when she conceived me and 13 when she had me. Yeah. So I always used to say that I'm before my time because she had me so young. So I was a straight A student growing up and just, you know, very successful. But here, the very thing that I said would never happen to me or that I would find myself in is the very thing that was happening to me.
I had to register as a sex offender every 3 months versus certain pedophiles and other, you know, sexual crimes, it's like 6 months. I mean, I was like very dangerous in their eyes. Couldn't be around minors without being supervised by their parents. To wear a GPS ankle bracelet and be monitored 24 hours a day. No alcohol in the house, I could not drink, I had to be home by midnight, I couldn't watch pornography at all. They could ask me to bring my computer in at any time to interrogate it. I couldn't be on any social networking, not even Facebook. That's where pictures of my nieces and nephews are. I had to go through all these psychological tests to take some phallometric assessment test to see what really stimulates me sexually, which I think has something to do with putting a device on my penis. Polygraph tests. Every 6 months for the rest of my life, you're going to hook me up to this machine and you're going to ask me these same inane questions. I can't live like that. And I can't live under that probation system that is so suffocating and, you know, just cruel.
On Fox, a warning from a woman infected with
the arrest of an HIV-positive prostitute
warning the public tonight about this
for hiding his HIV-positive status at swinger
and the man
parties.
called the HIV predator will make his
so-called HIV predator could someone with intent to kill.
Why they are releasing her picture, calling him a threat to society.
The media, the military courts, whatever, they could call me whatever they wanted to call me, but I knew I wasn't those names that they were calling me. I just was a human being trying to, you know, just wanted to fit in, just wanted to be loved, but it seemed like that 3-letter word HIV just had me stuck. I didn't realize the stigma on HIV and AIDS until I was diagnosed. Many people not wanting to go get tested, you know, because they're afraid that if tested positive, if they had unprotected sex with someone and someone tries to get them in trouble.
Him reacting, the way he reacted is the way that is the reason why most people are afraid to disclose, because of the fear and because of the stigma that comes from it.
The HIV criminalization needs to be changed.
You know, my stepfather is a promise-keeping Baptist. You know, he is salt of the earth and veterinarian, small town. And I told him this stuff, and he's just like, "That is horse shit."
But what I've done since then is just devoted myself to advocacy, to volunteering, to getting involved and learning more about HIV and AIDS, and with hopes that that could open the door for me, because obviously this is my life now.
All right. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. Please remember to fill out your evaluation forms. Thank you very much, Dr. Carey, for a great presentation, very stimulating presentation.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And please join us next month on July 21st, and we'll be hearing about from Larry Krause, who is at Public Health Institute in California. He'll be shining a spotlight on disabilities. So thanks for joining us, and have a great weekend.